Mr. Zemba, I believe we were left off when you were looking at Table 6, the planned responses to potential restoration deficiencies, correct? Right. And
he weren't good. Sorry.
And is, I know you've just had a chance to review this for the first time, but does that seem appropriate for this type of adaptive management?
Well, I mean, the whole problem with the you know, the mitigation, the monitoring, the adaptive management, I mean, there's nothing in there that talks about, you know, the loss of state threatened black-throated blue warbler population. What happens if and when that never returns? What about the state endangered cerulean warbler? What happens when if and when that never returns? Who's responsible for compensating those losses?
And based on your experience, say for working for Connecticut DOT, what type of measures will be implemented to address that?
Find another site.
Sorry?
Either find another site or to do an incidental take permit.
All right. And that's what you had to do out in Connecticut, because that's what the regulations required, correct?
Well, the incidental take permit specifically allows you to address and find ways to prevent that loss. So, for instance, you know, when we talked about the rail corridor, we had one endangered and one threatened plant species that would have been obliterated by the new track, and so we had to file an incidental take. They had us explore ways to avoid that loss. We decided that we would move those plants out of the way and put them in suitable habitat out of the impact zone. We did that in year 1. We went back to monitor in year 2 before the track was built, and a whole new crop of plants had sprung up where we just moved the plants out of. So we moved those too. And so we had actually doubled the size of the population through that incidental take permit process. And so I don't see anybody talking about doing any, what about painted trillium, which is special concern, which was found right in the impact zone there.
Well, let's talk about, I'm talking generally about this planned response. There's no incidental take permit at this location, correct?
Okay, so you're just going to write off these species?
I'm asking the questions, which is,
there
is no incidental take permit, correct?
Correct. And you had asked me about the adequacy of the mitigation plan, and so I thought I was answering that.
Yeah. I want to look at the schedule at 3.5. And again, this talks about, I want to go to maybe the third line where it says planting will be targeted to occur between September 1 and October 15 to maximize survival. Does that seem a reasonable time frame? Did you see that?
3.5.
3.5.
Planting will be targeted to occur to maximize survival.
Does that time frame of September 1st to October 15th seem reasonable?
Yeah, it's reasonable. Yeah, it would depend on what the climatic conditions are in the year of planting.
So it could be subject to change depending on weather.
Right. It's reasonable in that they're trying to avoid planting in the hottest part of summer.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the incidental take? Because I have to tell you, I've been doing development in Rhode Island for over 25 years. I've never dealt with that issue. Can you tell me what that is? An incidental take?
Yeah, well, I guess you've never dealt with it because Rhode Island doesn't have that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is it again?
So in Connecticut, if the proposal that you set forth is going to result in impact to a state listed species, you have to do an incidental take permit. And so it includes like an assessment of the species' life history to see what the special habitat attributes are for that species, and can they be recreated elsewhere. What other types of measures can you take to prevent the loss of that species and maintain the population?
Finished? Okay. When you say impact, is that essentially the destruction of at least their environment?
Well, it could be a direct impact or indirect impact. It could be a direct impact in that you're directly impacting the species itself or an indirect impact, and you're changing the habitat, so eventually the habitat would become unsuitable for that species.
But when it says incidental take, what does that take mean?
Well, so I don't know a lot of the exact details of that, because we've always been able to avoid the impact.
Avoid and minimize, right?
And therefore we haven't had to do the incidental takes. There's been perhaps 2 projects that I've worked on where we've had to do that. One I just mentioned with moving the plants. And so my role as an ecologist was to identify exactly what are the special habitat attributes. Like, for instance, why do we have black-throated blue warbler in this forest at Clear River Energy Center and not in other forests of Rhode Island? You know, it's state threatened, so it's only 3 to 5 locations in the state. So why doesn't it occur in other large forest blocks? Why do we have arrowhead spiketail in this stream and not a multitude of other streams throughout the state? So that's what my role as an ecologist is to figure that out.
Okay. Going on to section 4.0, construction best management practices. The first bullet talks about a clearing of trees will not take place between June 1st and June 31st, and I can represent to you that Endangered has committed to that. Would I be wrong if I guess that you think that that should be a larger time frame, assuming clearing is going to go forward?
So I believe the June 1st to July 31st pertains to that federally protected species, the northern long-eared bat. If you're talking about protection to other species of conservation concern, that's an inadequate period of time.
All right. Do you provide in your written testimony anywhere a proposal of what a time frame you would suggest for tree cutting?
I don't think I did.
For the record, I think you misspoke and said June instead of through July 31st.
I'm sorry.
So.
Thank you. June 1st to July 31st is what your text says on page 14.
Right.
Thank you. And then the next one talks about consulting with RIDEM and the Army Corps to determine whether the construction of new vernal pools would enhance the overall wildlife habitat. And that's a conversation that would occur, obviously, with the Army Corps and DEM about reconstructing or constructing new pools, correct?
As permitting authorities, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And I think you said in your, perhaps in your testimony, whether it's about general compensatory mitigation, one has to understand that the vernal pools might not always take when you create new ones, correct?
Correct.
And then the next one says intact tree snags will be left in place and new snags will be created in or around wetlands to provide tree cavities and perch sites where doing so would not interfere with project-related infrastructure. Does this relate to birds?
A whole host of wildlife will use tree snags, so it'd be birds, it'd be cavity nesting mammals, it would be bats, even the whole whole host of the saprophyte ecosystem. These are the animals that decay wood and break down wood and create rot, which is an alternative pathway of energy flow up through the food chain.
So do you think this type of mitigation or management practice is appropriate?
Yeah, typically Army Corps requires that for wetland restoration, so providing it in the upland would be beneficial too. And then as long as you're not taking an existing high-value tree and killing it to create a snag.
Right, I understand.
Yep.
Then at page 15 at the top, there's 5 bullets. Rather than reading through them, maybe you can just read them to yourself. And my question to you is whether or not you believe, you think that these are appropriate best management practices for the project if it goes forward.
Well, I don't see anything in there that mentions providing the special habitat attributes of all the listed species that were on the site.
Did you make any best management practice recommendations in your written testimony?
Don't believe I did. I may. It's hard to remember everything. I'd have to go back and read it again.
I didn't find any, so
Okay.
if someone does, let me know, but I didn't find any beyond those recommendations that you had made. So, we can put that down, that Exhibit 93, and we're going to move to a different document that I'm going to ask if you have seen before, which is Inventory 213. It's correspondence between DEM and ESS, and I'm sure Mr. Bianco will find a copy of it for you. It's going to be up on the screen. So if we go to the first page of it, it's dated from RIDEM June 13. It says 217, but I think that's 2017.
Okay, thank you.
Take a moment and just look through that, please.
Sure.
Mr. Zemba, have you seen these documents before? The letter from the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management dated June 13, 2017 to ESS, and correspondence dated June 19, 2017 to Ron Gagnon at DEM from Mr. Feinblatt.
I saw them when we requested it, when we were here during Mr. Ringler's testimony, and Mr. McElroy had requested copies of that.
And then did you subsequently review it once we had forwarded it to Mr. McElroy?
Yes.
Okay. And this addresses the biodiversity inventory summary that ESS did. Which is Exhibit 92B, dated August 2nd, 2017, correct?
Yes.
And generally, to summarize, I believe ESS had asked RIDEM for some guidance on how to do the biodiversity inventory summary. RIDEM provided some comments after the survey had been done, but then ESS provided an annotated response to DEM. Is that generally a fair summary of what this is?
I think that's fair.
All right. You fault ESS repeatedly in your testimony for not having done an inadequate biodiversity inventory summary, correct?
Correct.
Yet what DEM asked for and ESS responded, and this is on the letter, the next letter, the June 19, 2017 letter to Ron Gagnon. If you go to it says, "Dear Mr. Gagnon, this is in response to your letter of June 13, 2017, providing RIDEM's comments on the biodiversity inventory submitted by ESS for the Clear River Energy Center and project in Burrillville, Rhode Island," correct?
Yes.
And then Mr. Feinblatt explains they would hope to get comments sooner, but then in that third paragraph says, "Fortunately, as you will see from our responses below, there is nothing that RIDEM has suggested in your letter that has not been adequately covered by our surveys, which now, by and large, have been completed." Do you see that?
Where are you reading that line?
This is on page, well, is that Exhibit 213, it's the second letter in that group dated June 19th, 2017. It's addressed to Ron Gagnon.
Yes,
You see it?
I got the letter.
All right, and you go to the third paragraph.
Third paragraph.
First sentence. Fortunately, as you will see
okay.
from our
Yep.
responses below, there's nothing that RIDEM has suggested in your letter that has not been adequately covered by our surveys, which have now, by and large, been completed. Do you see that?
I do.
All right. So, do you disagree with the RIDEM suggestions that are in the June 13th letter from Mr. Gagnon?
I'm sure I do. Let's go through it.
Well, let's start first, which is, have you done a biodiversity inventory summary in Rhode Island?
Yes.
And how did you?
I may be a little bit late in my objection, but he was starting to answer the question and then he was cut off and she moved to a slightly different topic. So he clearly has some concerns about it. He should be allowed to express them.
I'll get to him. I'm just setting up a predicate.
Well, you had asked the question, he began to answer it, and then you cut him off. So I object to that, and I'd like him to just be able to answer it.
What do you have to say, Susan?
Well, I'd like to tell you what my concerns are of all the survey methodology.
Okay. We'll get to that, I promise you. But can I ask you this question first?
Okay.
How many biodiversity inventory summaries have you done in Rhode Island?
I don't know. I'd have to. I got 30 years experience. I'd have to go back and add things up.
Well, then maybe narrow it down. How about ones that you have done that have been submitted to DEM for freshwater wetland permits?
Again, I know, I'm gonna have to. I'd have to come up with a list.
Okay. Well, then you've done enough, right? What guidelines did you use to put together the program of how you were going to analyze the site?
Well, it depends on what the resources are on the site. I mean, they're similar to these, but typically, we use, like I said, multiple techniques per taxa.
Who is we?
We as ecologists, as professional ecologists.
So.
Okay, me.
No, that's
So-
fine. That's fine.
me?
I'm just curious.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
And when you.
Again, we're interrupting the witness in mid-answer, and I'd like, it really isn't proper.
You say that essentially you developed your own way to do the summary. Is that fair?
No, I'm not saying I developed my own way. I'm saying that I use industry standard practices and back and forth with not just one regulatory entity. You have input from other regulators like U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps, other stakeholders. If you're doing an impact statement, usually, you've had public participation from the very beginning. You've had advisory committees, you've had public information meetings, where things get vetted from multiple different angles before you get started.
So if you were working in your work as for a private developer, let's say, before you did this analysis, you would have public hearings with the stakeholders and meetings before you designed your biodiversity inventory?
If I was working for a project that was going to have a federal permit and eventually be required to have NEPA compliance.
So you at the outset would do it and not wait for the Army Corps or DEM to weigh in on that?
No, I'm saying you have them weigh in from the very beginning, and so typically, it's fine to start a permitting process at the same time as an EIS process, but typically you don't prepare your permit first and then do your EIS, environmental impact statement, because all the work that could be done, if there still doesn't address concerns at the end, now you got to go back and redo things or supplement the data. So it always makes sense to have consultation with all the regulators that may come into play from the very beginning before you go out in the field if you believe that NEPA compliance is going to be required.
You were here when Mr. Hebner testified this morning about the Army Corps permit, correct?
Yes.
And you are aware that that permit was submitted over 2 years ago, are you not?
I don't know what permit's been submitted. Last I checked with the Army Corps, they said they had not received a complete application yet. So maybe a permit application was submitted, but it's not complete. So
Who did you speak with at the Army Corps?
I'd have to check. I'm sorry.
I would ask that that information be
Sure, we can
provided.
provide that for you.
And if there's any emails or notes of that, please.
Yep.
Yeah, can we make that a record request? Thanks. All right, let's get into the substance of this, and is it okay to use the ESS letter because it's got the original statements from DEM and then ESS
Sure.
comments? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Before, before we start going down each individual one, is there any overarching theme or disagreement that you have with the RIDEM requests?
My overarching theme is that despite what was done, the studies are still inadequate to address all the potential rare species that may occur out there, and therefore it's really is kind of premature to be talking about mitigation until you understand what all your resources are and what needs to be mitigated for.
So you disagree with RIDEM on this issue?
On some of the issues, yeah.
You agree with them on some of them?
Yeah, like I said, we could go through and I'll tell you which ones I agree and which ones I disagree.
All right, let's start with migratory. Actually, you know what? Let's use the RIDEM letter, which is the first page of Exhibit 213. So the first category is migratory and breeding birds. Agree or disagree with their comments?
I hesitate to interfere with my sister's questioning, but it would be a lot easier for me, and I think for the board, if we could use the letter that is currently up on the screen, that has not only RIDEM's concerns, but ESS's response to those concerns, so that we don't have to go back again and also go through the full list for ESS's response. We can deal with them topic by topic.
That's fine, Mike.
Thank you.
Do you have overarching concerns with ESS's responses?
Yeah, I can provide them as we go.
All right, let's start with migratory and breeding birds. DEM comments are any behaviors indicative of breeding and the locations of those behaviors should be reported for each species detected. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
For amphibians, it says pitfall traps alone will be insufficient for amphibians. DEM recommends supplementing that effort with other sampling methods, including log rolling or stone rolling in streams and dip netting in wetlands. Do you
Again,
agree?
I'm
or
sorry, go ahead.
Disagree with that?
Again, it's not my questioning, and I understand, Ms. Noonan, that you can do it any way you want to do it. But I was hoping that we could deal with them by topic, so we could deal with A, the DEM suggestion, and then B, the ESS response to the suggestion, and have Mr. Zemba comment both on the DEM suggestion as well as the ESS response, topic by topic, if that would fit with your plan. If not, I mean, I guess I could go back on redirect, but.
So if I do this, you won't do redirect?
I won't do if you do it that way, I won't do redirect on this exhibit.
Okay, then let's do it that way, Mike. Makes a good suggestion.
Hold you to it.
That's right. All right, we're back to migratory and breeding birds. You have indicated that you agree with DEM's comment there. And do you, the response then that Mr. Feinblatt made was when breeding behaviors have been incidentally observed, this information along with the location was reported. Dedicated avian surveys have consisted of point count surveys at 13 locations within the study area. I have two questions. One, do you believe it's responsive to DEM's request?
Of
or comment?
So they did provide the breeding behaviors in accordance with acceptable methodology, the Breeding Bird Atlas methodology, and they did provide those locations. However, the breeding season for some breeding birds begins earlier than the year than when they did the breeding bird surveys. So it's there is possibility that they missed some breeding.
Mike, can I turn off?
But yeah, I guess I'll get
Sorry.
feedback. Yeah. They miss some species. There is a potential that they miss some species from based on the time period that they did the breeding bird survey.
But DEM in its comment did not put a time period of when those behaviors should be reported, correct?
Correct.
Ready to go to amphibians? That says, pit traps alone will be insufficient for amphibians. DEM recommends supplementing that effort with other sampling methods, including log rolling or stone rolling in streams and dip netting in wetlands. Do you agree with DEM's comment?
So I guess this is going to be a recurring thing. I guess DEM is not indicating appropriate time periods of when these should be done, and other performance metrics to verify the effectiveness of these surveys. So yes, pitfall traps alone are insufficient for amphibians. I agree with that. Yes, I agree that DEM should supplement the pitfall efforts with other sampling methods, including log rolling, stone rolling in streams, dip netting in wetlands, search sampling through the different habitat types, and then they mentioned call surveys are useful for frogs. I agree with that.
Before we leave in that first category, so where it talks about the pitfall traps, you believe, or do you believe that ESS's response is appropriate to the comments from RIDEM?
So, the problem with the pitfall trapping is that it was conducted in, I believe it began in mid-April. So conceivably they missed the whole month of migratory movements of vernal pool species, and typically during those movement time periods, it's not a uniform distribution of movement. You get that first warm rain of an otherwise cold period, and now there's a huge rush. I mean, they want to mate, so they've woken up, and now it's just a rush to a big mating party. And if you're late to the party, then your chance of hooking up are diminished.
You're talking about Tinder for amphibians? Okay.
But
generally, if I may, I don't mean to cut you off, but is it fair to say that you, again, disagree with DEM in that they didn't put any timing restrictions on? Does that make sense? Is that right?
Yeah, DEM should have indicated that your time period should be sufficient to make sure that you've captured these migratory movements.
So you do disagree with DEM in its comments?
So
as to time?
As to time.
Okay. What about call surveys?
Well, because they didn't provide the time, right?
Right.
I don't see a time.
So let's, when we go through this, I don't think there are any time frames that I recall that they mentioned, so can we just say they didn't mention the time frame? I know you told us what the shortfalls are. Otherwise, we'll be here for days and days and days. So does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it's an important topic.
Oh, I agree.
So I don't often have issue with the methodology per se. In other words, a methodology that ESS used in terms of the techniques, I would not argue that that is an invalid technique. But the issue is when those techniques were deployed, the frequency of deployment of those techniques, the fact that multiple techniques for many of the taxa were not used, some species aren't accurately captured by certain sampling methodologies. That's why you have to use multiple methods. And so there's huge data gaps in the biological survey because of the timing. And Mr. Ringler stated repeatedly in his testimony that the goal was not to try and sample for as many species as can be found on the site. He said the goal was to sample for the most species at any given time. And so I would agree that in terms of species richness, the number of species that you could see in any one given time out there, June would be appropriate. But if you're trying to determine species of concern, you have to look at when those species are going to be out on the site and not perhaps buried underground, down in South America, because they haven't migrated up yet. Perhaps they haven't emerged out of or transformed from a larval stage, hidden away in leaf litter or inside the interior trunk of a tree, things like that. You have to sample them during the time period where you have the best chance of sampling them. And oftentimes that was not done for many of the surveys.
And that was not recommended by DEM to do in their correspondence and comments to ESS, correct?
I don't know why it wasn't. Probably a major oversight. Either that or they're just assuming, as Mr. Ringler being a professional wildlife biologist, that he would know better. Certified wildlife biologist, sorry.
Thank you. But ultimately, DEM is going to have to, it's going to have to review the wetland permit in line with the study that was done. If they feel it's insufficient, they can go back and ask. But this is what they've told Endangered to do. It's what Endangered did. And if later in the permit DEM wants more, they can always ask for that, right?
Well, I believe DEM said that their only purview is to comment on wetland species. Majority of the species found on site, the endangered cerulean warbler, the threatened black-throated blue warbler, the threatened bobcat, these species use the upland. So there's nobody in the regulatory process that's apparently has the purview to comment on the inadequacies of these surveys.
I think that really answers my concerns and how you view this and how for DEM and where we are. I'm not going to go any further with this exhibit.
I'll reserve my right to ask a rebuttal then.
Except for the first page.
Sure.
Following up on that statement which you just made, I'd like to return back to the DEM Supplemental Advisory from August of 2017.
Thank you.
Page 15. Starting with the paragraph, in addition. Let me know when you get there. It's up on the screen also. Page 15?
Of which?
Supplemental?
Which supplement?
The supplement. The DEM Supplemental Advisory Opinion. you want to go from the screen instead, Mr. Zemba?
Yeah, I have it, yeah.
You got it done? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to start at that first full
I'm
paragraph.
sorry, what page?
15.
50.
And this was in August of 2017, so you also had this when you did your rebuttal testimony in September of 2017, correct?
Yes, I believe it did.
So it starts out, in addition to the impacts outlined above that are clearly regulated by DEM, the facility will also impact the environment in other ways as a result of construction and operation. Construction of the facility will require substantial clearing of upland areas. In both its advisory opinion and this supplemental advisory opinion, DEM has expressed concerns over such clearing, including impacts on upland ecosystems and habitat, as well as conserved and recreational lands which are highly valued in this area in Rhode Island. You see that?
I do.
They go on to say, this is Mr. Gray, unlike proposed impacts to wetland ecosystems, proposed alterations of upland areas are not subject to similar regulation, and no standards for acceptable impacts are established in state or environmental law. Or federal, sorry, state or federal environmental law. Do you agree with that statement?
I disagree with that statement.
What part?
There is a federal environmental law, the Endangered Species Act, that would come into play if you're going for a federal permit and you have potential to impact federal species of conservation concern. Then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will have input and will regulate the activity.
As it pertains to this project, is there any federal environmental law regulating any of the species on the property?
Yeah, the Endangered Species Act.
Right, but physically, are there any species that are listed under the federal law that are on this site?
Well, the spotted turtle is a federal review species right now.
I'm sorry, is what?
Spotted turtle.
Yeah, is.
It's a federal review species.
But it's not a threatened species, correct?
Correct.
Or endangered?
Correct. It's under review to see if it would be proper to list it as endangered or threatened.
So at this point in time, there are no federally listed species on this site, correct?
Well, review species are included with that category. So they're listed as review. So if you're talking about listed species, on the federal level, you have endangered, you have threatened, you have review, you have petition, there's different categories. So it's listed as a review species.
So is it your testimony that this subject property needs a permit under the Federal Endangered Species Act?
I'm saying if there's any federal involvement, which apparently there is, Army Corps of Engineering, you will have to you'll have to assess what the impacts are to species of conservation concern. And that one of them is the spotted turtle, which is a review species. There could be other federal review species out there, like the wood turtle or the New England cottontail. And so there wasn't any specific studies to address that, the presence absence. There's also the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which comes into play, which says that you can't, if you're looking for a federal permit or a federal involvement in a project, you have to assess what the impacts are to migratory bird species.
Again, then my question directly to you. At this point in time, there are no federally threatened or endangered species that have been identified on this site, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Continuing to read on page 15. Without such standards, DEM is unable to render an opinion on whether these proposed impacts are acceptable or not. However, DEM strongly urges the EFSB to consider the foundation of the wetlands regulatory construct when evaluating this area, that such impacts must be avoided and minimized to the maximum extent practicable through specific conditions and requirements if the facility is ultimately approved. Do you agree with that statement?
What do you mean, do I agree with it? Like, let's see. I mean, yeah, I would strongly urge the EFSB to consider the foundation of the wetlands regulatory construct when evaluating this project in terms of functions and values. We talk about functions and values of the wetlands, and there's a permitting process that makes you have to address that. Sorry, I thought I had turned that phone off. Sorry about that. For uplands, there are functions and values of upland species and habitats as well, and I would hope that the Energy Facility Siting Board is both qualified and would consider the functions and values of those resources, especially when you have state endangered and multiple and state threatened and multiple other species of conservation concern all in one area.
But still it comes back to avoiding and minimizing to the maximum extent practical, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Zemba.
Thank you.
Redirect?
I do have a little bit of redirect. You've used the word a number of times, and just briefly, just so that we're all on the same page. When you say the word resources, you need
Hold
to...
on. Right.
I'm hoping to get it done, so I have like 5 questions. When you
Don't
use,
rush.
when you use the... Thank you. When you use the word resources, could you tell us what you mean? You have to identify the resources on site.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so it may not be clear. When I use resources, it's a faster way of incorporating all the potential environmental receptors that would be subject to this unacceptable adverse impact from this facility, and it includes multiple levels. So it includes the species level, like endangered and threatened and concerned species. It includes community levels, like whole functioning ecosystems. It includes a landscape level. It includes both biotic and abiotic resources. Abiotic meaning the wetland resources, streams, vernal pools, seasonal pools, or special aquatic sites. I'm sorry, we're in Rhode Island. Inland wetlands. It includes the special habitat attributes of the habitats. So it's all encompassing of all the different interwoven and interconnected aspects of ecology, where if you impact one, there's a ripple effect throughout that network of interconnection.
You used the term resources when you said that with regard to the proposed mitigation site, one of the things that you would need to see is a biological study or survey of that site to identify the resources there. Could you explain why you feel that's important?
Yeah, and so if you're talking about mitigation of sensitive environmental receptors on the Clear River Energy site, you're not necessarily going to provide mitigation just by acquiring another parcel. That parcel could be completely overrun with invasive plant species. A number of them were listed in that section that we read about the initial April assessment that ESS did when they went out there. Things like Asiatic bittersweet or Oriental bittersweet, Celastris orbiculatus, Oriental bittersweet. We could just stay with that, right? And shrub honeysuckles. To say that you're going to compensate the loss of all the sensitive environmental receptors of conservation concern from one site just by acquiring another parcel, even if that parcel is bigger, is inappropriate without the backing evidence to support that.
You were asked about the mitigation plan. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And one of the things that was discussed was no tree clearing from June 1 to July 31st. to accommodate the breeding season for what I believe was the northern long-eared bat. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Right. And is it your feeling that there needs to be a longer period of time in which there would be no tree clearing to accommodate other species?
Yes.
And could you give us your concerns in that regard?
Yeah, and again, it would have to be site specific. So, typically we would want to do tree clearing outside of the breeding season of as many species of conservation concern as possible. And so typically the way you approach that is you do a phenogram of all the species that you've documented on the site, and you do that phenogram. It's like maybe perhaps a bar chart going across the different months. You lay that all out. There could be dozens and dozens of species. You see where the most overlap is. Sometimes it leaves no months, so you're forced to have to pick a month where you have the least amount of impact. Oftentimes that's winter, and the ground's frozen, so perhaps you won't be destroying some of the habitat features of the ground because everything's frozen in place, and you could get large equipment out there. But if there's a winter owl roost out there of a listed species, then winter wouldn't be appropriate for that site. So you don't know until you've done your biological surveys and understand what all the resources are and what the special habitat requirements are, and then try and go from there.
Now, the mitigation plans that the Army Corps of Engineers and DEM will work to put together, they're specifically directed to mitigate loss or adverse impact to wetlands, correct?
Correct.
Are they at all directed to mitigating loss or adverse impacts to uplands?
Army Corps of Engineers is not. If there's going to be a federal involvement through the NEPA process, through the National Environmental Policy Act process, then typically the U.S. Fish and Wildlife gets involved as a cooperating agency, and they will have input on mitigation for impacts to upland species and wetland too.
And so if the Army Corps of Engineers receives a completed application and makes a determination that an EIS is in fact required, I assume the Army Corps of Engineers will then consult with Fish and Wildlife in that regard?
Yes.
That's the usual process?
That's the usual process.
After lunch, you started out by saying that you wanted to clarify something about a possible misunderstanding regarding review of the plans. Do you feel you've clarified?
I'm sorry, but we're 3:45.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make sure that I did look at.
We're going to have to stop.
What? Well, I have some questions. Do you have any questions? I think that he's going to have to come
We'll
in.
bring him back, no problem.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No
We'll see you
problem.
Wednesday.
Oh, wait, what? When?
The 20th.
The 20th. That's what I was scheduled originally to come
Yes.
back. Yeah, yes. See you on the 20th. Thank you.